Well, ladies and gentlemen, when in AD 750, Guru Rinpoche flew into Bhutan, where he delivered Buddhism, he did so riding on the back of a tigress. You can just see her tail in the picture there. Later, in 1993, when 5,000 pastoralists in Bhutan were encircled by the designation there of the Jigme Singwe Wanchuk National Park, they were therefore very warmly disposed towards the tigers that lived therein. However, their happiness, and you'll remember that Bhutan wisely measures itself by gross national happiness, began to fade when legislation restricted their use of the forest and banned killing any wildlife at all. Now, using camera traps, we calculated that this wonderful park safeguarded some 8 tigers. And while the world might rejoice, the 20% of farmers losing stock to tigers and leopards were much less happy. They earn about $250 a year, of which a tiger or leopard attack costs them about 84%. 52% of villagers blamed the park for all their hardships. Our scouts trudged 1,000 kilometers of mountain trail to collect 34 tiger droppings and 113 from leopards, confirming both do indeed eat livestock. However, the farmers weren't blameless themselves. Husbandry was inadequate. 60% of the farmers failed to construct adequate nighttime corrals for their stock. Now, my point is that where people meet nature, especially when it's red in tooth and claw, and even when the people are culturally well disposed to, in this case tigers, there is often conflict. So nature can cost you money. It can also earn you money, and indeed it saves us a lot of money. So my purpose tonight is to illustrate to you the diversity of these financial aspects of biodiversity's encounters with the human enterprise, and then to raise the question of who pays and by what mechanism. So let's start with sport hunting, which generally operates within some form of market wherein price indicates desirability, which prompted us to trawl through brochures for African game hunting. Was rarity valued by the hunters? A sinister variant of the phenomenon whereby 24-cent stamps now sell for $800,000 did for the prophetically named giant yellow croaker. This fish was only discovered in 1937. Their swim bladders were so valued by some hokum-pokum medicine that soon 50 tons were being landed annually. The single last yellow croaker ever caught in 2008 fetched $130,000. Now, the croaker may have croaked, but the enduring point is that its value was inflated so spectacularly by rarity that its exploitation remained economic even as it approached extinction. Now, those hunting brochures we looked at revealed just such an effect of rarity for bovids, that's wild cattle. Furthermore, deteriorating IUCN status correlated with higher prices for bovid trophies to hunters. Rarity increased their desirability. The price lists also revealed an interesting sizist effect, which interestingly shows that bigger bovids were more expensive, but is much more striking for wild felids, big cats. Big means pricey, to the extent, ladies and gentlemen, that 500 to 1,000 lions are shot for trophies annually, each at about $50,000 to $100,000, all in economies where hard currency and lions are scarce. Now, this recreation is abhorrent to some, but others argue that it offers a hope for the survival of lions in many parts of Africa. So, to Zimbabwe. Is the viability of Hwange National Park's lion population affected by the quota licensed to the adjoining hunting estates? Lion Society, as you probably know, is founded on male coalitions. An obvious starting point is that shooting a male lion might disrupt his coalition, prompt his faster turnover, increase infanticide and other multiplier effects cascading from just one death. And this prompted our lion team, seen here attending an elephant's tea party, to estimate that 22 males roamed in that park. Their ranges, at least some of them, straddled the park boundary, beyond which lurks the face of supposedly sustainable use. In the year 2000, hunting trophies were licensed for 60 male lions. Since only about 22 males existed, the quota, you will see, was unsustainable. But 72% of the adult males that we tagged were actually shot by hunters. So, a park the size of Wales, that being the standard unit for measuring area in conservation circles, was too small because of a vacuum at the boundary drawing males into the interior, from the interior into the firing line. Trophy hunting of lions was, thanks to our data, and I'm proud of it, suspended in the year 2005. What would happen? What happened is that males trebled and coalitions doubled. Now, Keynes famously quipped that in the long run, we're all dead. Which is exactly why, with the fear of political land grabs, short-termism had caused the offtake of males to double, halving the sex ratio. 4 years of moratorium restored it. Hunting restarted in the year 2009. The quota was then set not at 60, but at 4 male lions. So, things went wrong because the original quotas were set in the absence of adequate data. All the landowners saw lions, but they all saw the same lion, and so overestimated their abundance. Things got worse because political insecurity made sustainability irrelevant. And they got even worse because of what I call a perturbation effect, prompting territorial strife and infanticide amongst the lions. Nonetheless, information, education and regulation within a market context led to people modifying their behaviour for the better in this case, and Zim's lions may have been saved by a whisker. The next example is much less encouraging. Yearly in the Congo Basin, bushmeat equivalent to 4 million cattle is harvested. The human population grows by about 2.4%, and 1% of the forest is felled. So we investigated sustainability between the Cross River in Nigeria and the Sanaga River in Cameroon. This is a hotspot of endemism and includes such charismatics as the drill, the Cross River gorillas and chimpanzees, Preuss's guenon and Preuss's red colobus monkey. On average, each Nigerian market traded almost 3,000 wildlife carcasses a year. Cameroonian ones a bit over 1,000. 95% of the 100,000 bushmeat items we logged were mammals, extrapolating to 1.35 million individual mammals annually, 16% of which were primates. For species such as the putty-nosed monkey, these extraction rates are a signpost to extinction. And when prey are lost, of course, their predators too are doomed. The size of these blue dots on the map is proportional to the numbers of endangered Preuss's red colobus monkey traded in that particular market. They and many others were traded more closer to Korup Park. Of the 10,000 or so blue duiker traded in 3 months, price rose, as the graph shows, with distance from protected areas, raising fears of a vacuum effect outside the park and poaching within it. So who were the consumers? Although about 1/3 of people lived in towns, only about 5% of bushmeat was sold to them. So for the average urbanite, bushmeat is nutritionally trivial. 95% of bushmeat biomass was traded dispersed amongst the 2/3 of the people who live in near rural markets. The larger the settlement, the less the supply of bushmeat per person, and the higher its price. So bushmeat in cities may be largely a luxury for the middle classes, for grouse on the glorious 12th, think gorilla soup. Set against the extinction risk that this exacerbates, this urban trade, I would say, merits little sympathy and no tolerance, and should be staunched by education and regulation. Everything from bats to elephants was on sale in these markets, but turtles and snakes were pricey, and price reveals what consumers value. Carcass price increased with body size, but larger items are cheaper per unit mass, irrespective of taxa, from rodents to primates. Although snakes of the genus Bitis were cheap for their size, as was Emin's unappetizing pouched rat. chimpanzees were depressingly expensive. Furthermore, taking brush-tailed porcupines as an example, price fell on days when more porcupines were on sale, so consumption of vulnerable species might be discouraged by increasing their price, say fines for possessing primates. However, substitution of that sort could only work if there's enforcement, and so to the stick. In October 2007, amidst commendable fanfare, President Obiang of Equatorial Guinea passed legislation prohibiting nationwide the hunting, sale, consumption and possession of primates. The impact was immediate, but sadly not long-lasting, as you can see. Till now, no hunter has, to the best of my knowledge, been fined at all. So much for markets in wildlife. What of the cost of living with nature? Let's whiz back to Zimbabwe, where for "a fox ate my chicken," read "a lion ate my cow." So, reprisals for depredation result in a second hemorrhaging at Hwangi's border, this time of lionesses. What's to be done? We're discussing the options. So let me start a rather twisty journey now towards some generic answers to the killer question: who pays? I'll attempt some generic taxonomy of conservation problems and their solutions, introducing you to two frameworks with their acronyms, the BICS and the PECS. I'll explain in a minute. All the projects I've mentioned so far necessitate research to understand the problem, education to explain it, community involvement to ensure participation, and implementation of solutions. These ingredients apply whether we're considering species, imperiled or numerous, asset or pest, or ecosystems. On the road to sustainability, there is, I think, an iterative process flowing from the problem to the solution. And this is what I call the Biodiversity Impacts Compensation Scheme, BICS. Imagine a species in conflict. Problems can be partitioned between the reducible and irreducible elements, and the balance between these will shift as currently intractable elements are rendered reducible by innovation, itself engendered by the research component of the quartet. Mitigating reducible problems minimises current conflict, and the residue is the currently irreducible problem. Depending on levels of tolerance, themselves heavily influenced by education, the problem will be either bearable or not. The unbearable component will require an interim solution. Options are either to control the problematic creature or to compensate the aggrieved stakeholder. What are our options? Broadly, ladies and gentlemen, I think there are three. There's education, which necessitates information, ultimately from research. There's regulation, which necessitates enforcement, and there's incentivization, which provides a basis of valuation, such as a market. Glibly, this is it. It'll cost you to do it, or it might pay you to do it. Of course, these three are all interwoven. So in Zimbabwe, we're dab hands at erecting road signs and cutting snares and then turning them into the raw materials for alternative livelihoods in snare art. And incentivizing conservation brings us to the PECS, the payments to encourage coexistence, the term we've coined for such financial schemes as compensation and insurance, revenue sharing and conservation payments, which seek to protect species which are highly valued globally, but which have little or even negative value locally. A classic market failure, isn't it? The ideal PEC would be a framework for translating global value of, for example, big cats into tangible local benefits large enough to drive conservation on the ground. And such an ideal PEC might meet 7 criteria: minimizing conflict, reducing costs, providing additional revenue, avoiding moral hazard, not requiring external revenue, conditionality, and reducing poverty. By these criteria, no one existing financial mechanism is perfect, according at least to our ticks and crosses, so we developed a framework that would tick all the boxes. This combined PEC envisages traditional streams of conservation revenue flowing into a central fund, which is then distributed to the local community. Community-driven development initiatives would provide benefits to the community-wide, while a compensation scheme would minimise the cost to those most directly disadvantaged. Both these approaches may sway attitudes, but neither incentivises conservation. So additional payments would be made contingent on the delivery of conservation goals, success encouraging further investments. So here's a bit of conflict for you. Might a community better tolerate predators if the financial cost of living with them was offset by compensation for their depredations? We explored this with regard to the 30 or 40 lions in Botswana's Magadikitti Pans National Park, where many of the park's neighbours were hostile to lions, a point these chaps are making by setting about eating this one. In retaliation for an outbreak of stock raiding in the year 2000, 8 lions from the park were killed, reminding you that however many people in a community might value lions, it takes only one with some poison and traps to obliterate them. But did the community value them? Questioning the inhabitants revealed that the closer they lived to the park, the greater they perceived their losses, the more negative their attitudes towards wildlife in general and conservation, and in particular lions. However, 13% of cattle were nonetheless left out overnight in the park. 81% of herders confessed, unabashed I might tell you, to not gathering all their stock at night. That, however, did not make the 59% of them reporting lion kills any less cross about it. The annual profit and loss account reads a bit like this. The average cattle post lost $283 to lions, totaling a community-wide loss of $33,000 a year. That compensation at 80% of market value could not be claimed for cattle killed untended in the park was evidently insufficient incentive for retrieving stock at night. Consequently, only 42% of the stock lost to lions was ever compensated. Now, on the profit side, tourism, to which the lions are absolutely crucial, earned $300,000 a year. Nonetheless, most people disliked living near a national park, mostly because of stock losses to predators, and only 15% of herdmen professed any inclination to improve their stockmanship. 61% of herdsmen thought the park should be fenced. 16% thought all the lions should simply be shot. The nub of the problem was that in this particular case, the benefits of lions didn't accrue to the individuals who suffered the losses. For them, the fact that the lion paid for a school or a hospital 30 kilometres away didn't cut much ice. But paying for nature isn't the prerogative of leophiles. Society increasingly does just that here in Britain, through agri-environment schemes. Initially, payments supported production, but since 2005, Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer have increasingly paid farmers as custodians of the countryside, providing fiscal incentives to restrain the free market. So policies should deliver what they, the taxpayers, might want. Perhaps meeting local environmental targets, minimising soil degradation or mitigating and adapting to climate change. Considering the potential of corridors and the hazards of fragmentation, would it help, we wondered, if clusters of farmers could be coordinated? So we compared 2 areas, they're the shaded ellipses in this part of Oxfordshire, where neighbouring farmers were persuaded to enrol in agri-environment schemes in order to join up their activities. And we compared those to 2 control areas, that's the empty ellipses, where the scheme uptake was purely laissez-faire. So consider moths, beautiful in themselves and on the menu for bats and birds and much else beside. It turns out, using them as indicators, that wide margins and hedgerow trees both increase moth diversity. And the effect of hedgerow trees on moth abundance was significantly stronger where the farmers had been targeted to join up their activities. So targeting agri-environment schemes increased landscape connectivity and seemed to provide Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer with more biodiversity bangs per buck. Payments for ecosystem services lead me to Sulawesi, straddling Wallace's Line and the 4-tusked Babirusa. They and their forest were threatened with hunting, illegal logging and agricultural encroachment. Started by my then student, Lynn Clayton, a series of Darwin Initiative projects catalysed the gazetting of Nantu Boliyohoto Wildlife Reserve in northern Sulawesi, which led us to a natural experiment. In northern Sulawesi, there are 3 protected areas. There's Nantu, that I've just mentioned, there's Panua Nature Reserve, and there's Bogani Nani Waterboni National Park. But only Nantu has had substantial international conservation investment, actually about £800,000 worth of British taxpayers' money through the Darwin Initiative over 12 years. So was forest protection more effective where that investment had been made? Deforestation at Panua was actually a bit worse inside the park than outside of it, which wasn't very encouraging. Whereas at Bogani, it was only twice as bad outside the park as within the protected area. But strikingly, it was 6.5 times better inside Nantu than in the surrounding area. So it seemed the investment had paid. But could the Babirusa and its conservation be shackled to payments to reduce carbon emissions through deforestation in these forests, transforming therefore REDD+, which we heard so eloquently and interestingly about from the ambassador, into what I'm calling a PEC, a payment not just to reduce emissions, but also to encourage coexistence with biodiversity. Well, with Stern's review and the Bali Conference and thoughts of compensated reductions to the Coalition of Rainforest Nations ringing like cash registers in our ears, we asked whether Nantu would qualify for REDD+, with or without biodiversity conservation as a condition. As a start, obvious and awkward questions include: which institutions will manage REDD? Where will the required, is it 17 to 35 billion annually come from? How will the world of carbon traders and their loot impact the lives of illegal loggers and biodiversity? So how might it work? We created a systematic framework to test whether Nantu qualified for REDD on the assumptions that REDD+ is a payment for ecosystem services defined by Wunder as a voluntary transaction with a well-defined service purchased from a provider on the condition that the provider secures the provision. Now, the resulting checklist has to be tested both locally at Nantu to ensure additionality and nationally to guard against leakage. So first, is there a well-defined service, the provision of which is additional? To illustrate our approach, here's an abbreviated table of tests, just to give you an idea of the issues. It's a bit rough, but I hope it'll serve its purpose. Well, REDD's proposed to reduce carbon emissions from forest clearance and degradation. So that's a well-defined service, isn't it? But it isn't clear to what extent REDD can be configured to provide biodiversity conservation as a co-benefit of controlling carbon pollution. However, at Nantu, we have demonstrated that carbon is saved, that there is additionality, and the whole place is hooching with co-benefits for biodiversity if a deal could be struck. So, since Indonesia loses, is it 2 million hectares of forest yearly, it seems a pretty safe bet that REDD investments could provide some additional benefits there. But to be sure, you'd need to monitor changes in forest protection before, during and after any investments, just as we did at Nantu. Let's take the next 2 tests together, because time's short. Are the land tenure frameworks and legal frameworks for forest management clear? No time for the detail, but both nationally and at Nantu, the answers are probably all no's. Can the forest owners secure with permanence forest conservation as a condition of payments? Nationally, if I could quote G.K. Chesterton, the past was far from promising, the future none could tell. But at Nantu, we've demonstrated that with the park guards, it is actually a yes. As for the duration of permanence, our crystal ball isn't that good. But the Darwin Project's alternative livelihood schemes there have surely moved attitudes, at least in the right direction. So where does this leave us? If REDD is implemented in Indonesia as a project-based system, Nantu should surely qualify. Money spent on a combination of rigorous enforcement and development benefits have respectively produced additionality and fostered sustainability. But everything depends on whether the rich industrialised countries stump up the required red money for the next few decades, and on resolving which institutions will manage the new flows of finance, which depend upon who controls the forest, which depends upon clarification of tenure and property rights, which depends upon clarification of regional autonomy laws, and that's before we get to how to bundle the biodiversity co-benefits up with the carbon. The point is, and others mentioned it earlier this evening, that modifying human behaviour towards nature hinges on economics, but economics, as Oscar Wilde didn't quite say, is about value as well as price. We know now, and I've told you about it, that people will pay $6,000 a year to keep a lion alive in parts of Kenya. But how much is nature worth? Obviously, some aspects of nature can be traded and thus have a monetary value, and I'll call those its price, whereas for other aspects it's difficult, perhaps impossible, and arguably dangerous to monetize them. This is awkward because environmental policy involves tough choices, and choices are even tougher to make between things whose value is measured in different currencies, and even worse if they can't be measured at all. So how would you value Stonehenge, or Van Gogh's sunflowers, or Catherine Lightfoot's indigo sheep, which I happen to prefer to Van Gogh? You might consider the tourist income at Stonehenge, or the prices of comparable paintings. But suppose the buyers wanted to convert Stonehenge into a quirky fast food restaurant, or to use the paintings as kindling. What value would you put on stopping them? Your problem is that the value is greater than the price. Less hypothetically, what value would you put on stopping clouded leopards being driven extinct by converting their habitat to oil palm plantation? Your horror is not traded and thus can't readily be monetized by normal markets. Now, we've spent ages here trying to conserve water voles. No time to tell you why, but it's a good idea. But there's no market in water vole habitat. How might it be priced to reflect its value? That's the water vole habitat I'm talking about. Now, a chap called Peer and White et al. Had already reported, using contingent valuation, that focus groups were willing, that's if you believe them, to pay an amount, we'll call it T, to conserve water voles at a site. Now, knowing the size of the site, we calculated the value of each metre of restored or preserved water vole habitat. Extrapolating to the whole UK, an exercise which even the most forgiving amongst you might think preposterous, revealed that citizens value each metre of water vole habitat in this country at up to £12 as a one-off payment to ensure the well-being of water voles for time immemorial. How might we use this insight? First, while taxpayers will always want the best price, it tells us that they judge as not worth it any policy that cost more than an average of £12 per metre of water vole habitat. Second, by dealing simultaneously with the issues of incommensurables and marginal values, and by considering monetary value as a proxy for votes, it helps us with the apples and oranges problem of choosing between water vole habitat and, for example, butterfly habitat or, for example, schools. Third, most importantly, we can convert this average value of a metre of water vole inhabited waterway into a measure of the marginal benefit to the local water vole population. An isolated metre of habitat is of use to neither man nor vole. It becomes worth £12 only if voles are likely to survive on it. So we calculated vole viability per extra metre using ecological models, then incorporated that into the valuation system, replacing the flat value, which is quite useful for cost-benefit analyses, with the marginal value that guides policy to invest most where the marginal gains are greatest. Suppose you were considering investing in a new water vole habitat on a farm whose neighbour already had, say, 900 metres of occupied water vole habitat. The marginal value of each new metre would be equal to its own contribution to housing voles, plus the value it confers on nearby water vole real estate. If you invested in 150 new metres, each would be worth £38 because of the extra viability they collectively add to the existing vole population on your neighbour's land. In contrast, if you created these 150 new metres in isolation and away from any other water voles, each would be worth only £3.50, because 150 water vole metres is worth nothing to them or us. I'm anxious, ladies and gentlemen, about basing conservation priorities on monetary values, since in normal markets, most actors on nature's stage have none. And while focus groups may cheerily invest in voles, nematodes might be a tougher sell. Perhaps better to value habitats than species then, but value clearly hinges on education, itself a limited resource. Education, I think, is as important as the self-interest of markets in modifying people's behaviour. A few examples from our own work. Wild Crew's Lion Theatre Group has now performed our data to more than 6,000 village children. In Ethiopia, we've opened the Ethiopian Wolf Football Stadium. And in Oxford's Wytham Woods, we involve rehabilitated drug addicts in monitoring mammals. But for us, the crescendo has been establishing our diploma in practical conservation, with an emphasis on big cats, the so-called Wild Crew panthers hailed from Burma to Brazil, each returning to propagate their new skills through their communities. So our purpose is to inform and thus to modify people's attitudes and thereby their behaviour, creating a cooperative, extended family that can travel together towards a shared future. Thank you.